The Maya by Dr. Michael D. Coe. Chapter 4, Classic Splendor. The Early Period. During a span of 6.5 centuries, from about 8250 to 900, the Maya, particularly those of the central area, reached intellectual and artistic heights which no others in the New World, and few in the Old, could match at that time. The Classic period was kind of a golden age, not only for them but for the rest of the Mesoamerican peoples. Large populations, a flourishing economy, and widespread trade were typical of the Classic. But although it was once thought to have been a period of relative peace and tranquility in comparison with what followed, that notion has in the main been disproved. It is an equally unfounded assumption that the Classic peoples were ruled by priests. On the contrary, we shall see that the ancient Maya were just as warlike and had a thoroughly secular government as the supposedly more bloodthirsty states of the post-Classic. The Classic, in fact, can only be defined accurately as that span during which the lowland Maya were using the long count calendar on their monuments. In 1864, workmen engaged in digging a canal near Puerto Barrios on the steamy Caribbean coast of Guatemala came across a jade plaque which subsequently found its way to Leiden, Holland. The Leiden plate has engraved on one face a richly bedecked Maya lord at his accession, trampling underfoot a sorry-looking captive, a theme repeated on so many Maya stelae of later times. On the other side is inscribed the long count date, 8-14-3-112, corresponding to September 17th, AD 320. The style of the glyphs and the costume and pose of the person depicted call to mind the late Preclassic monuments of the highlands and Pacific coast, but in this case the date is preceded by the typical Maya introductory glyph, and the bar and dot numbers are followed by the signs for Baktun and lesser periods. Until 1960, the Leiden plate was considered the most ancient object dated in Maya fashion, but now we have Stela 29 from Tikal, erected in 8-12-14-8-15, AD 292. Thus, the lowland Maya had definitely received the long counts by the close of the 3rd century AD. From this event until the Classic's downfall, we have a very closely dated archaeological sequence governed by the carving of stelae and other monuments, which themselves have been tied at Uwashaktung and other sites with the construction of floors, building stages, and tombs. The Classic conveniently divides into an early and late period at about AD 600. This division is not merely an invention of the archaeologist, for not only did a profound upheaval take place in part of the central area at that time, but there are considerable cultural differences between the two halves. Teotihuacan, a military giant. Two things set off the early from the late Classic. First, the strong Itzapan element is still discernible in Maya culture, and secondly, the appearance in the middle part of the early Classic of powerful waves of influence and probably invaders from the side of Teotihuacan in central Mexico. This city was founded at about the time of Christ in a small but fertile valley opening onto the northeast side of the Valley of Mexico. On the eve of its destruction at the hands of unknown peoples, at the end of the 6th or beginning of the 7th century AD, it covered an area of over 8 square miles and may have had a population of between 100,000 and 200,000 people, living in over 2,000 apartment compounds. To fill it, Teotihuacan's ruthless early rulers virtually depopulated smaller towns and villages in the Valley of Mexico. It was, in short, the greatest city ever seen in the pre-Columbian New World. Teotihuacan is noted for the regularity of its 2 crisscrossing great avenues, for its pyramids of the sun and moon, and for the delicacy and sophistication of the wall paintings which grace the walls of its luxurious palaces. In these murals and elsewhere, the art of the great city is permeated with war symbolism, and there can be little doubt that war and conquest were major concerns to its rulers. Repeated painted figures of jaguars, pumas, coyotes, and eagles bring to mind the warrior orders of the much later Aztecs, among whom the eagle and jaguar knights played roles similar to the crazy dog warriors of the Great Plains. Teotihuacan fighting men were armed with atlat-propelled darts and rectangular shields, and wore round, decorated pyrite mosaic mirrors on their backs, with their eyes sometimes partially hidden by white shell goggles, and with feather headdresses. They must have been terrifying figures to their opponents. At the very heart of the city is the massive Ciudadela, in all likelihood the compound housing the royal palace. Within the Ciudadela itself is the stepped, stone-faced temple pyramid known as the Temple of the Feathered Serpent, TFS, one of the single most important buildings of ancient Mesoamerica, and apparently well known to the distant Maya right through the end of the Classic. When the TFS was dedicated at about 200 AD, at least 200 individuals were sacrificed in its honor. All of these were attired as Teotihuacan warriors, with obsidian-tipped darts and back mirrors, and some had collars strung with imitation human jawbones. On the facade and balustrades of the TFS are multiple figures of the feathered serpent, an early form of the later Aztec god Quetzalcoatl, patron god of the priesthood. Alternating with these figures is the head of another supernatural Ophidian, with retrocessed snout covered with rectangular platelets representing jade, and cut shell goggles placed in front of a stylized headdress in the shape of the Mexican sign for year. Carl Taube of the University of California, Riverside, has conclusively demonstrated this to be a war serpent, and has proved this to be a potent symbol wherever Teotihuacan influence was felt in Mesoamerica, and in fact, long after the fall of Teotihuacan. Such martial symbolism extended even to the Teotihuacan prototype of the deity Tlaloc, who, fitted with his characteristic goggles and year sign, also functioned as a war god. This was the mighty city that held dominion over large parts of Mexico in the early Classic, as the center of a military and commercial empire that may have been greater than that of the much later Aztec. Drawing upon historical data on the Aztecs, the ethno-historian Rost Hessig has suggested that Mesoamerican empires, such as Teotihuacan's, were probably not organized along Roman lines, with total replacement of local administrations by the imperial power. Rather, they were hegemonic, in the sense that conquered bureaucracies were pretty much left in place, but controlled and taxed through the constant threat of the overwhelming military force, which could have been unleashed against them at any time. Thus, we can expect a good deal of local cultural continuity even in those regions taken over by the great city. But in the case of the lowland Maya, we shall also see outright interference in dynastic matters with profound implications for the course of Maya history. The Esperanza culture. The disintegration of the Maya culture in the highlands began with the close of the Miraflores period, when building activity slackened at major sites. In fact, by the end of the Preclassic, the great ceremonial center of Caminahuyu, focal point of Maya cultural and political affairs in the southern area, appears to have been a virtual ruin. Shortly after AD 400, the highlands fell under Teotihuacan domination. An intrusive group of central Mexicans from that city might have seized Caminahuyu, where they built for themselves a miniature version of their capital. An elite class consisting of both central Mexican foreigners and of a local nobility, with whom they had marriage ties, could have ruled over a captive population of largely Maya descent. Whatever their origins, see below, they were certainly swayed by native cultural tastes and traditions and became Mayanized to the extent that they imported from the central area pottery and other wares with which to stock their tombs. The Esperanza culture, which arose at Caminahuyu during the early Classic then, is a kind of hybrid. There are several complexes of Esperanza culture, architecture at Caminahuyu, all built on a plan which is not in the least bit Maya. Essentially, these are step temple platforms with the typical Teotihuacan talud tablero motif, in which a rectangular panel with inlet is placed over a sloping batter. The good building stone, which is so abundant in the Mexican highlands, is missing at Caminahuyu, so that the architect, almost certainly a Teotihuacano himself, had to be content with clay faced with red painted stucco. A single stairway fronted each stage of the platform, while on top a temple sanctuary was roofed either with thatch or with the more usual flat beam and mortar construction of Teotihuacan. The lords of Esperanza phase Caminahuyu chose the temple platforms themselves as their final resting places. As with the earlier Miraflores people, each platform was actually built to enclose the ruler's tomb, a log roof chamber usually placed beneath the frontal staircase, successive burials in their platforms being placed over older ones. The honored deceased was buried in a seated posture upon a wooden bier and was accompanied to the other world not only by rich offerings of pottery and other artifacts, but also by 1 to 3 persons sacrificed for the occasion, generally children or adolescents. Surrounding him were rich funerary vessels, undoubtedly containing food and drink for his own use, as well as implements such as metates and manos needed to prepare them. Jade ornaments, some in the process of manufacture, were recovered in quantity from the Esperanza tombs. Beads, complex ear ornaments in the form of flared spools, pendants, and spangles are ubiquitous. Underneath one staircase was found a 200-pound boulder of jade from which V-shaped slices had been sawn, indicating that the Esperanza elite had access to the Rio Motagua Valley. the source of this substance so precious to all the peoples of Mesoamerica. Few of the pottery vessels from the Esperanza tombs are represented in the rubbish strewn around Caminahuyu, from which it is clear that they were intended for the use of the invading class alone. Some of these were actually imported from Teotihuacan itself, probably carried laboriously over the intervening 800 or 900 miles on back racks such as those still used by native traders in the Maya highlands. The ceramic hallmarks of the Teotihuacan civilization are the cylindrical vessel with 3 slab feet and cover, a little jug with open spout and handle, the florero, so called from its resemblance to a small flower vase, and thin orange ware, made to Teotihuacan taste in northern Puebla. All are present in Esperanza, but so are polychrome bowls from the Peten with their peculiar basal flanges. Certain of the tripod vessels have been stuccoed and painted in brilliant colors with feather-bedecked Teotihuacan lords or seated Maya personages and both Maya and Teotihuacan deities, including the butterfly goddess, a symbol of the warrior cult, so popular in Mexico. One Peten Maya polychrome bowl had even been overpainted with processional figures in Teotihuacan style, speech scrolls curling from their mouths. All sorts of other valuables were placed with the dead. That Esperanza pomp, perhaps the funeral itself, was accompanied by music is shown by shell trumpets and by large turtle carapaces used with deer antler beaters as percussive instruments. On a large effigy, incense burner from one grave, a seated person strikes a 2-tone slit drum. Besides jade, the corpse was ornamented with pearls, cut-out pieces of mica, and rich textiles which have long since rotted away. Included in several tombs were pairs of jaguar paws, symbols of royal power among the highland Maya. The highest technical achievement is seen in the mirrors made up of pyrite plates cut into polygonal shapes and fitted to each other over a circular disc of slate, and could have been back mirrors for warriors. These are all, in likelihood, another import from Teotihuacan, but the reverse of one proved to have remarkable carving in an elaborate scrollwork style that is associated with the classic Veracruz civilization, then developing on the coast of Mexico. The ability of the Esperanza rulers to amass luxurious objects from the most distant parts must have been considerable. In an effort to find out exactly where these individuals in the Esperanza tombs had originated, Dr. Christine D. White of the University of Western Ontario subjected samples of the bones and teeth to oxygen isotope analysis. The results were mixed. The elite occupants, as well as sacrifice retainers, were both local from Caminahuyu and foreign. Of the latter, some may well have come from Teotihuacan. Interestingly, the molars of one noble tomb occupant appeared to suggest that he was born near Caminahuyu, but possibly spent his early teenage years at Teotihuacan. The Esperanza culture may have its spectacular side, but almost as striking are omissions. The long count calendar had disappeared from the southern Maya area for good, which is strange considering its ancient roots here. The figuring cult had utterly disappeared, nor is there any indication of stone sculpture on any scale in Esperanza Caminahuyu. The evolution of Maya culture in the southern area, especially in the highlands, had come to a very abrupt end with the establishment of Teotihuacan hegemony and, apart from the imports of Peten products, Maya ways of doing things were replaced with Mexican from the early classic on. Were these intruders warriors or traders? They may well have been both. By Aztec times in central Mexico, there was a special caste of armed merchants called Posteca, who journeyed into distant countries in search of rare manufactures and raw materials not available in the homeland, all of which were destined for the king. From representations of the Posteca god at Teotihuacan, we know that the institution is at least as old as the early classic. Thus Caminahuyu may have been a southeasterly outpost of long-distance traders from that great city, established for the purpose of exporting Maya riches for the Teotihuacan throne. As will be seen, the presence of foreigners from Teotihuacan was felt through the Peten and as far north as Yucatan itself. As for the vanquished Maya of the Guatemalan highlands, they must have continued on as before, rendering tribute to Mexican rather than native overlords, tillers of the land, and laborers on public construction projects. The great public ceremonials of Caminahuyu may even have been forbidden to them. but one cult in which they were certainly allowed to participate was centered upon Lake Amatitlan, not far south from the Esperanza capital, where hot springs and fumaroles along the southern shore must have attracted annual processions rendering homage to the gods of water and fire. Skin divers had brought up many hundreds of blackened vessels from the hot mud of the lake bottom, ranging from extraordinary incense burners to the pots and pans of the peasant household, all cast by devotees into the steaming waters. In 1969, farm tractors plowing the fields in the Tiquisate region of the Pacific coastal plain of Guatemala, an area located southwest of Lake Atitlan that is covered with ancient and untested mounds, unearthed rich tombs and caches which contain a total of over 1,000 ceramic objects. These have been examined by Nicholas Helmuth of the Foundation for Latin American Archaeological Research and proved to consist of elaborate two-piece censers, according to Carl Taube, symbolizing the souls of dead warriors, slab-legged tripod cylinders, hollow mold-made figures, and other objects, all in the Teotihuacan style. Numerous finds of fired clay molds suggest that these were mass-produced from Teotihuacan prototypes by military merchant groups intrusive from central Mexico during the last half of the early Classic. Zaco culture in the central area. Early Classic remains in the central area are burdened with towering constructions of late Classic date, and it has only been since the 1960s that this elaboration of Maya civilization during this early period has been fully realized. The Zaco culture, as the civilization of the Peten and surrounding regions is called, endures until about 98000, or to round it off in Christian years, until AD 600. Already, Maya civilization is in full flower, with enormous ceremonial centers crowded with masonry temples and palaces, facing onto spacious plazas covered with white stucco. Stela and altars are carved with dates, and the finest examples of which were sealed up in the tombs of honored personages, emphasizes stylized polychrome designs of cranes, flying parrots, or men, often on bowls with a kind of apron or basal flange encircling the lower part. Along with these purely Maya ceramics are vessels which show the imprint of distant Teotihuacan. Again, the cylindrical vase supported by 3 slab legs, the small spouted jug, and the florero. There have been 2 schools of thought about the nature of the Teotihuacan presence in the Peten. Initially, following the discovery of royal tombs in Tikal's North Acropolis in the 1960s and of associated stela, some Mayanists, especially the late Tatiana Proskuriakov and the art historian Clemency Coggins, argued for a takeover by rulers actually hailing from Teotihuacan. Subsequently, the majority opinion came to be that there was never an actual military intrusion of Teotihuacan people, but emulation by the local Tikal dynasty of the Teotihuacan cult of war, which the dynasty adopted for their own political ends. This is the scenario which appeared in the previous 2 editions of this book. Which of these is the correct one? From the latest epigraphic discoveries of David Stewart, it now appears that Proskuriakov and Coggins were right all along. Dynastic rule among the lowland Maya clearly has its deepest roots at Tikal, the great city of the northern Peten, whose classic name was Mutul. The name Tikal only appears in the 19th century. Later dynastic annals have retrospective reference to a putative founder, one Yasheb Shuk, who may have lived in the 1st century AD. Uashaktun, less than a day's march north, is significantly younger than Tikal. According to these inscriptions, the 8th successor to the Tikal throne was an individual known to epigraphers as Chaktok Ich-Aak, the first, Great Jaguar Paw. But we know little about him other than his untimely end, which took place on January 14, AD 378. The Maya phrase referring to his demise states that he entered the water, that is, the watery underworld. On that very same day, according to the inscriptions, a figure named Siyachkak, Fire is Born, is laconically said to have arrived from the west at Tikal and Uashaktun. Significantly, he had previously arrived at El Peru, a Peten center on the upper Rio San Pedro. This would have been a natural route for an army marching between the Gulf Coast Plain and Tikal. The verb arrive is surely a euphemism for something more sinister. These 2 events are probably intimately connected. Shiachkak was in no way a member of the native Tikal dynasty of Great Jaguar Paw, but rather the lineage and perhaps general of a strange figure whose very non-Maya hieroglyph is a spear thrower conjoined to an owl, a motif well known in the iconography of Teotihuacan, and Stewart hypothesizes that spear thrower owl could have even been a ruler of that fearsome capital. The arrival of Xiahkak strongly suggests that the sudden appearance of a Teotihuacan invasion force from the west, and the capture and immediate execution of the legitimate Maya ruler. Whoever spear thrower Al might have been, within a year his own son Yash Nu'un Ahi'in, first crocodile, previously dubbed by archaeologists with the nickname Curl-Nose, had been installed, presumably by Xiahkak, as the 10th ruler of Tikal, thereby initiating a new dynasty of patently foreign extraction. Yash Nu'un Ahi'in was yet a boy when he succeeded to the throne. We have not one but two portraits of the young Aha king, attired as a Teotihuacan warrior flanking Stela 31, the accession monument of his own son Xiahchan Ka'wil, along with a stela that records the death in AD 439 of the latter's grandfather, spear thrower Al. Burials of great richness, filled with luxury offerings of Teotihuacan and local Maya origin, have been uncovered beneath the Zacal temples of Tikal's North Acropolis. Not so much Acropolis as the long-revered necropolis of the city's earliest kings. These include the tombs of both Yash Nu'un Ahi'in, who died in AD 420, and his son Xiahchan Ka'wil II. Burial 48 is now generally accepted as the final resting place of the latter, following the suggestion by Clemency Coggins. The tomb chamber was cut from the soft underlying bedrock and contained 3 interments: Xiahchan Ka'wil himself and 2 adolescent victims sacrificed to accompany the dead king. The white stuccoed walls have been covered with glyphs applied in black paint by a sure hand, including the long count date 9/1/1010, March 20th, AD 457, probably the date of the ruler's death or his funeral. During the 1960s and early 1970s, a period which saw the apogee or nadir of Maya tomb robbery in the southern lowlands, the modestly sized site of Rio Azul in the northeasternmost Peten was heavily looted and produced for the international market an extraordinary variety of elite objects of the utmost beauty, mainly but not entirely of early classic date. 3 of these empty tombs had Zacal culture murals painted in red and black on the bare walls, including glyphic texts of dynastic nature, and a scene depicting the undulating surface of the underwater world, a theme linked by Nicholas Helmuth with Xibalba, the Maya realm of the dead. A project led by R.E.W. Adams of the University of Texas, San Antonio, uncovered several intact tombs with early classic offerings, although not of the skill or magnificence of those already stripped of their finery. We now realize that the royal dead, including those of Rio Azul, were accompanied by the food and drink to which they had been accustomed to in life, such as maize tamales. It will be recalled that chocolate had been in use as early as 600 BC. One magnificent Rio Azul pottery vessel with a screw-on lid was stuccoed and painted with glyphs, among which one was read by David Stewart as the word "caca-a," or cacao. When residue at the bottom of the jar was tested in the laboratory of the Hershey Foods Corporation, traces were found of both theobromine and caffeine, both important alkaloids in chocolate. QED. If, as some scholars believe, Teotihuacanos were present in the Peten cities, might have tried to impose the worship of their own gods upon the Peten Maya, substituting their own rain god for the native Cha'ak. To this upper part of a shattered stela from Tikal, showing a large Tlaloc-like face exactly like that upon the shield of Stela 31, might be a testimony. A more plausible interpretation is that this is a portrait of a foreign overlord attired as the Teotihuacan war god, who we know had Tlaloc characteristics. On finely stuccoed and painted vessels from the Tikal tombs is the blue-faced Tlaloc again, together with the Mexican god of spring, Xipetotec, recognized by the open mouth and pairs of vertical lines which pass through the eyes across the cheeks. Some of these vessels are thin orange ware manufactured in the Mexican highlands, others from the Tiquisate region on the Pacific coast of Guatemala, while others represent hybrids in shape and decoration between Maya and Teotihuacan traditions. There almost certainly was a lively trade between the Peten and the Valley of Mexico. Zacal sherds from basal flange bowls have been found at Teotihuacan, and green obsidian blades from central Mexico were placed with the Tikal dead. However, all of the perishable products which must have traveled the same routes, textiles, quetzal feathers, jaguar pelts, wooden objects, and so forth, nothing at all remains. The wonderful Maya mural art has its roots in the late Preclassic wall paintings such as those found at San Bartolo and Tikal, but by Zacal times it had reached a very high degree of elaboration and naturalism. Destroyed since their discovery in the 1930s, the lovely early classic wall paintings of Temple B13 at Uashactun were executed in muted tones of red, brown, tan, and black. The scene is one from real life. Before a palace building sheltering 3 Maya ladies, 2 male figures, one painted a warlike black, are in conversation, which is undoubtedly recorded in several columns of indecipherable glyphs. At one side are 2 horizontal rows of figures, probably meant to be standing on 2 levels of a step platform, painted with a strong feeling for individual caricature. A few are chattering in exciting discourse. Some are singers shaking rattles, while a small boy beats time on a skin-covered drum. Not only in the northern Peten, but at many other places in the central area, major Maya centers were well established by the 5th century AD and even earlier. At these, Teotihuacan domination is less easy or even impossible to demonstrate, and one can suppose that this was restricted to the Tikal Uashactun area alone. Nonetheless, Yasha, a small Maya city located southeast of Tikal, has a stela in pure Teotihuacan style, apparently depicting a warrior goddess with a Tlaloc mask, and a city plan which combines the amorphous Maya pattern with formal streets laid out in the central Mexican fashion. Yasha, incidentally, is one of the few classic Maya cities to retain its original name. Alcance and Ek Balam in Yucatan are others. Just north of the Peten lies Calakmul, a huge Maya city with ancient roots going back to the middle Preclassic. According to its excavator, Mexican archaeologist Ramon Carrasco Vargas, by the early Classic it had already begun to establish a network of alliances that by the late Classic had made it into a formidable rival of Tikal. Testimony to its affluence and power is the immense structure tomb on the south side of the main plaza, renovated in the early 5th century over an already large late Preclassic building. Throughout the Classic, Calakmul's history would be recorded on the largest number of stela known for any Maya site, most of them sadly of low-quality limestone and therefore badly eroded. Whatever might be the nature of Teotihuacan influence on the affairs, both political and cultural, of the Peten Maya, in the last half of the 6th century a serious crisis shook Tikal and Uashactun. In AD 562, Tikal was attacked and conquered by Caracol, a former ally, with whom they had just broken relations, probably with the aid of Calakmul, which prospered as Tikal's fortunes fell. For 130 years following that event, no more stelae were erected at Tikal, and there are signs of widespread and purposeful mutilation of public monuments. It is not clear what all this means, but although none of the Peten sites actually seems to have been abandoned near the close of the early Classic, there might have been fierce internecine warfare or perhaps even a popular revolt. When the smoke clears, in the first decades of the 7th century, classic Maya life is seen to have been reconstituted much as before, possibly with new rulers and new dynasties. But Teotihuacan was no longer a political and or economic force in Peten Maya civilization. In some great event of which we have no written record, the central part of that city was destroyed, and the empire of which it was the capital came to an end. This took place by AD 600, and may have been a decisive factor in the Maya disturbances in the closing decades of the early Classic. However, just as the memory of the achievements of classical Greece and Rome has remained forever strong in Western civilization, so did the glories of Teotihuacan continue to live in the minds of Maya rulers right through the end of the late Classic. A Maya king was always proud to take the field attired as a Teotihuacan-style warrior, fitted with the characteristic war serpent headdress or helmet. Copan in the early Classic. Although relatively isolated in a remote valley on the southeastern perimeter of the central area, not even Copan escaped the heavy cultural grip of Teotihuacan. According to much later inscriptions, the Copan dynasty was founded in the early 5th century by Kinich Yaxcucmo, great son Quetzalcoatl. This royal line was to persist essentially unbroken until the death of the 16th ruler in AD 820. Yet there must have been earlier chiefs or even kings who failed to be recorded in the annals of the late classic. The key to the dynastic history of Copan is the square monument known as Altar Q, which celebrates an event in the life of the 16th king, Yashpasach Chanyo Pa'at, which took place in AD 776. Around its four sides are seated this ruler and all the previous 15 kings in succession, each on his own name glyph. Facing Yashpasach Chanyo Pa'at is Yaxcucmo himself, handing him the baton of office. While all these potentates wear the wrapped turban characteristic of Copan rulership, only the founder is adorned with the goggles of the Teotihuacan war god. As deciphered by David Stewart, the text on the altar queue's upper surface begins with the arrival and accession to the office of Yaxcucmo in AD 426. This brings to mind the arrival of Xiachkak in Tikal during the previous century, and it must be more than coincidental that both are given the honorary title of West Calomte, paramount ruler of the West. Stewart interprets all this to mean that the founder was another stranger coming in from the West, perhaps from Teotihuacan. In an extraordinary marriage of epigraphy and dirt archaeology, Copan's modern excavators are beginning to confirm what was previously only known from the inscriptions. Rather than destroy late classic buildings to get at earlier constructions, in recent decades, American and Honduran teams investigated Copan's huge acropolis with several kilometers of tunnels, working in from the Great Face exposed by past ravages of the nearby Copan River. As shall be seen, the most spectacular discoveries have been made underneath Temple 16, a mighty pyramid now known to have been dedicated through the centuries to the cult of the royal founder Yaxcucmo. During the 1996 and 1997 field seasons, Robert L. Scherer and David W. Sadat of the University of Pennsylvania hit archaeological pay dirt, the very earliest and most deeply buried structure of all in the Acropolis, nicknamed by them Hunal. This was a relatively small temple platform in the purest Teotihuacan architectural style, complete with talud and tablero. Intrusive into Hunal, they found a vaulted masonry tomb containing a single raised burial slab on which rested the cinnabar-covered bones of a male individual over 50 years of age, with jade inlaid in scissors. Rich offerings of Teotihuacan style and other ceramics lay nearby. There is every reason to believe that this is Yaxcucmo himself, the stranger from the West. One supporting piece of evidence comes from radiographic analysis by the University of Mexico's Dr. Jane Wickstra and her associates, which show that this individual had suffered a severe deforming fracture of the right arm at some time in his life. And the portrait of Yaxcucmo on altar Q depicts him with a small shield hiding his lower right arm from the view. Initially, archaeologists suspected that he was a native of Teotihuacan. Recent isotopic analysis on his teeth indicate that he spent most of his youth neither in the Valley of Mexico nor in Copan, but rather somewhere in the central Peten lowlands, perhaps even at Tikal, but by adolescence had moved closer to Copan. Soon after this interment, Hunal was covered by another temple platform, this time in the familiar apron molding style of the Peten, and faced with a fine stuccoed and polychrome panel of the Maya sun god. And over this, Copan's second ruler placed an even more splendid platform, known as Margarita. This is adorned on its western face with an extraordinary stucco relief of two birds, a quetzal and a macaw, a full figure form of the founder's name. And within Margarita, what is probably the richest tomb ever discovered at Copan, of an aged female whom Professor Scherer hypothesizes was the widow of Yaxcucmo. Among this noble lady's lavish offerings was what the excavators called the dazzler pot, a stuccoed slab-legged tripod brilliantly polychrome with a Teotihuacan temple, from the doorway of which peeks a bird face with goggled eyes. Could this be the founder himself? In the summer of 1992, the long-term project directed by William Fash of Harvard University encountered what appeared to be Copan's oldest monument in a deep exploratory tunnel underneath the famous hieroglyphic stairway. This seems to be a marker set into a floorstone sometime early in the 5th century AD, and depicts Yaxcucmo, probably posthumously, and his son and heir facing each other across a central pair of glyph columns. Both are completely attired in Maya style. Here at Copan, on the southeastern periphery of the Maya lowlands, native culture proved to be stronger than the alien philosophy imported from central Mexico. Previous tunneling into the mass supporting the hieroglyphic stairway has disclosed a 5th century temple which may be contemporary with Yaxcucmo. While much destroyed by later building activities, enough has remained of the upper facade to see that it was covered with an enormous crocodile in stucco relief. At about the same time, Copan's first ball court was constructed, out in the open plaza to the northwest. This was to be the first of 3 successively built on the same spot, and already had stone macaw heads as boundary markers, as in the final one seen by modern tourists. One of the more exciting discoveries at Copan in recent years was made by Honduran archaeologist Ricardo Agurcia. Dubbed the Rosalila structure, this is a temple dating to the close of the early Classic, which had been buried almost intact by later building, and gives Mayanists a good idea of what the splendor exterior of an impact stuccoed and polychrome temple looked like before time and the elements had done their work of destruction. Even part of the roof crest is preserved. On the front facing west is the principal bird deity, Wukub Kakish, in all his glory. His huge head with sun god eyes is on the 2nd story, and his serpent bird wings are spread out on the upper facade of the lower one. An archaeological bonus was the find of sacred objects left on the floor of Rosalila, including 9 eccentric flints which had been wrapped in blue cloth, some of which still adhered to the flints. Unlike in the northern Peten, there is no hiatus, no gap at Copan between the early and late Classic. The 11th ruler, Buchchan, spans the gap, dying peacefully in the year AD 628. Although war was eventually to bring temporary reverse to Copan's fortunes, being on the periphery of great civilizations sometimes has its rewards. The northern area. There is abundant pictorial and glyphic evidence for warfare across the Maya area during the early Classic, but proof of warfare is remarkably difficult to derive from dirt archaeology. A vivid exception to this rule is provided by Bacan in the Chenes region just north of the Peten, which was completely surrounded by massive defensive earthworks sometime between the 2nd and 4th centuries AD. These consist of a ditch and inner rampart with a total height of 38 feet and would have been formidable, according to David Webster of Pennsylvania State University, if the rampart had been surmounted by a palisade. It would be tempting to see this as a consequence of a putative Teotihuacan invasion of the Chenes, but it is a purely Maya matter, as the earthwork was built before the appearance of strong Teotihuacan influence at Bacan. Some 48 miles to the east of Bacan is the beautifully preserved early Classic pyramid temple of Coonlik, with its inset stairway flanked by red painted stucco relief masks of the sun god, not the false sun PBD of the last creation, but the real one of our own, Kinich Aha, with his signature Roman nose and front teeth filled in the shape of a T. A good deal less is known about the early Classic in the stony land of Yucatan and Campeche than in the south. In both ceramics and architecture, these Maya adhered closely to Peten's standards. One of the earliest centers is Oxquintoc, in the scrubby plain of western Yucatan, with a stone lintel carved in the 5th century AD and some contemporary but aesthetically inferior reliefs. A more interesting site is the site of Acance, 13 miles southeast of Merida, the present-day capital of Yucatan. On the one hand, there are step pyramid platforms with inset stairways and apron moldings of a straightforward Peten Maya type. On the other hand, there is an extraordinary platform with a talud tablero facade stuccoed with relief figures in the pure Teotihuacan style. Among these are a puma, an anthropomorphic bat, birds of prey, a squirrel, a warrior with goggled eyes, and a representation of the central deity of Teotihuacan known as the feathered serpent or Quetzalcoatl, along with a repeated icon that has been read by David Stewart as Pu, reed in Maya, a reference to a place of reeds that many believe to be Teotihuacan itself. Apart from the bat, unknown in Teotihuacan iconography, there is little or nothing Maya about this building. On the contrary, it may be evidence that the dynamic people of Teotihuacan had established outposts not only in the southern and central areas, but also here in the northern area, foreshadowing the great Mexican invasions that were to take place in Yucatan 5 centuries later. This concludes Chapter 4.